We are so privileged in our diocese. We have a wealth of great preachers. I was so excited, Paul, to hear you talk about the ability of preaching to change the world, and I see it all the time. I get to see a lot of you preach in your context to your people, and there's such a range of styles and a range of experience. And so it's been a blessing to me to see all of you and how you're doing. But as you know, it's a lifelong mission to be a great preacher. It's something you have to work on all the time and cultivate. And so we wanted to talk with these 4 people who are 4 great preachers and learn a little bit about them, about their journeys and how they got here, what they do to keep fresh, what they do to do this well, and hopefully come away with 2 or 3 things that you could apply immediately in your context to be refreshed, to grow, and to develop in this area. So we'll start with just a few minutes for each one of you guys. If you could, tell us about your preparation time. How do you prepare to give a great sermon week after week, which all of you do, and all of you with busy lives? Sometimes I think, especially if we're church planters or we're in a small church, we think, well, those guys have all the time in the world because they've got big churches and staffs. But I know you all well, and there's not one of you with what I would call leisure time. So maybe you can start, Paul, by telling us about your preparation and development and how you do that.
For me, I found over the years, and I agree, Kimberly, there's always the threats coming into your prep time, and I find there's not a single week where I'm not actively battling 50 different distractions that can pull me away from the text. I find for me, I've got to work on it. In an ideal setting, I've got to have an idea at least a month out of where I'm going to go if I am on a series, just to spend the time to say, I'm going to, like in Lent, I'm going to work through Jonah. So I've got time just leisurely reading as I have a chance, just grabbing a moment here or there, just random thoughts through the week. When I get to the actual week of, I've got to spread my prep time over several days. I can't just pack it all into one day. I know some people do that well. I've got to do it, a few hours each day, just living with the text. I got to do it in a quiet setting. I'm still trying to figure out how to do that well, to be honest. I mean, I'm the first one to say that I have not figured out how to really protect my time from interruptions. And I don't know if it's about the space. Sometimes I'll sit at the Starbucks that none of my parishioners go to, and I'll, put earbuds in, which is the social cue that says "leave me alone," and try to work. But for me, it's got to be through the week. It's got to be a significant amount of time. And I do think that though I'll be working with the text for say over a month, just thinking here and there about it, I got to spend some longer time with the text. The way the Lord seems to work with me is I've really got to wrestle through down to, okay, Paul, what's really personally convicting me in the text, and that's never going to come up in 5 minutes. That's got to be a deep walk through that. Mm-hmm. So it's got to be through the week, and it's got to be there's got to be enough time, and there often isn't. Is that enough?
Yes.
From Tuesday, I don't think about it until Tuesday morning. From Tuesday to Thursday, I percolate in it. I marinate in the text, and that will look broadly like listening to about 6 sermons from other people on that same text. Basically people who exposit the text, because I don't really have time to read 20 commentaries. So I listen to people like Alistair Begg, John Stott, anyone from All Souls or St. Helens in England. So I'll marinate on it. I'm in the car a lot. It's Southern California, going doing carpool runs, evening soccer, things like that. So I'll podcast. My podcast is huge. I double speed every sermon, so I get through a sermon in about 15 minutes. And I'll just marinate in the text that way. And I'll make sure, I think on Wednesday, I'll spend about an hour just me and the text. And by Friday morning, I kind of feel I've got a good grip of what the text means from an expository perspective. And then also by then I've marinated in it enough that I've been praying through those 3 days, where, Spirit, do you want me to kind of really dig in without avoiding the main points, but where do you want me to take the main points of this text? And then Friday I leave the office. I don't go to the office at all. I go up to Malibu on the whole, which is a nice place to prepare a sermon. I know. I have this spot, I mean, just to make it even worse.
Ashley goes to East Atlanta.
I have a favorite spot in Malibu, literally. I have a favorite spot in Malibu with my headphones. And noise-cancelling headphones is the best thing for sermon prep. And I have rainforest kind of noise going off in the background. And I'll just spend a whole day writing and praying and going through a draft. Then I put it down and go home about 5 p.m. Every Saturday, I pick it up at 5 p.m. and go to work for about 3 or 4 hours. And that's where I kind of edit and bring it down to a manageable size. And then on Saturday night, I make sure it hits my 5 criteria for preaching. And then Sunday morning, I get up, I'll run through it for about an hour, and then the party starts.
And what are the 5 criteria?
Oh, okay. 5 criteria are double impact, number 1. Well, first of all, it hits the main point. Am I being faithful to the text? Mm-hmm. So, is Gordon Fee going to be proud of me, kind of thing? Am I being faithful to the text, number 1. Number 2, is this going to have double impact? So is it going to strengthen the Christian and draw in the non-Christian? So making sure it speaks to both types of people. We have lots of people who don't know Jesus coming through Alpha, and so we want to make sure that they feel that I'm speaking to them. So try and do a bit of Tim Keller's defeater question stuff, make sure my language is very non-Christian friendly, making sure that there's no Christian buzzwords that they wouldn't know or have to explain. Number 3 is I make sure that the Spirit is moving my heart through it, that I'm not a talking head, but I've got a heavy burden, and knowing where that is in the sermon. Fourthly, making sure time-wise it's less than 2,000 words as I write it out. And fifthly, make sure that, frankly, it's the audience that I preach to, making sure that this is going to be so crass now, making sure it's funny enough that people in LA kind of can stick with it. I literally have to go back and go, okay, is it relevant? Sure, but is it going to kind of keep them engaged? Yeah. And that's a tension, right? But
yeah. How long, sorry, one more question. When you say 2,000 words, how long does that make your sermons?
2,000 words is 30 minutes.
Okay, all right. And Paul, you're doing 25, 30?
I'm aiming for 22, and I always make it closer to 28.
So you're doing 25 or 30? Yes. They put up a new clock for you, didn't they?
It's called the Donison clock.
I asked for the clock. We have a parking lot we have to turn over, so.
Yeah, so just quickly in broad strokes, similar to Gare, my weekly rhythm, similarly, I don't look at the text until Tuesday. I guess backing up, maybe we about quarterly look at the lectionary and set our preaching texts as a team. Here's what we want to preach through. We, of course, start with the lectionary, and then, to your point, Paul, decide, given the season or the last time we preached in the Old Testament, we should probably veer from the lectionary at this point, and for these 4 weeks, spend extended time in wherever it may be, the Old Testament or wherever. And so we set that schedule as a team, and then we're preaching from that in both of our locations. So I usually know roughly what the text is going to be. But I need a day away from thinking about a sermon. So Monday for me is we don't talk about sermons on Monday. I don't listen to my own sermon. I don't listen to Chris's sermon. I don't listen to anybody's sermon. I just need a break. And then Tuesday we'll sit with the text, whatever it is, just look at it and have sort of initial thoughts. But don't spend any extended time. Wednesday is the first time that I clear a block of time in the morning to come in and really sit with a text and basically do a kind of lectio practice, similar to what happens in our devotional reading. You read through it a few times, and you pray and you think, and you jot down similarly big ideas, what comes to mind sort of immediately strikes you. And then whenever I have to leave it, I leave it. And then I don't come back to it until Friday, which for me is the best day on the week. I wish it were earlier in the week, but it ends up being the best day for me to not have to come into the office. I don't ever schedule meetings on Fridays. It's a reading and a writing day. And I'm able to, I like to go to coffee shops, actually. I'm one of those strange people where being around people is helpful for me. When it actually comes to writing, it contextualizes me in a helpful way. Otherwise, I either get too poetic or dramatic or preachery if I'm on my own, away from people. And so being in a coffee shop in East Atlanta is helpful. So I end up usually most often writing there. And, you have a few hours, and that's all you have. And when the time is up, the time is up. And it just has to be that. And that has been, for me as a church planter, but in particular over these last 4 years, something that I've really had to lean into. Not to think about on the onset because it'll make you panicky, but realizing there's a fixed amount of time here. And so on Fridays as a sort of, a habit now that I have just a discipline, I guess, before the Lord. For myself, I've had to put it down and walk away from it whenever the time is up on Fridays. And then similarly, Garrett, I come back to it on Sunday mornings. I'm an early riser on Sunday, especially if I don't feel good about what I left on Friday. I'm a particularly early riser on Sunday. And I get up and spend then the time doing a kind of check like Garrett was talking about. It's very similar, actually. Run through my tone, checking my tone. How does this sound? If I'm sort of talking through it, does it make sense? I had a preaching professor who would always say at the end of each one of our short homilies in class, she would come and get very close to each preacher and put a hand on your knee and say, "That was great. Now tell me what you were trying to say." And I hear her voice in my head now when I am going back through it on Sunday morning. "That was great. Now what are you trying to say?" And if I can't answer the question, then something's wrong. I need to know what it is that I'm trying to say. What is it that I'm trying to get across? And so then I go to church. That's the rhythm, roughly. I think maybe we'll come back to this. There is a lot, I think, that's really important about our engagement with the Bible and our engagement with the church that informs what is that's just the practice itself. But there's a lot about my own devotional time spent in the Bible that has nothing to do with preaching that informs that rhythm. I think you would all say something similar. Maybe we'll come back to that later.
So I don't think I have actually a lot to add to this other than to think about what Kimberly said about all of us living such fractured lives. I mean, like if you were to look at any given day in my life, I can literally be doing, it's not uncommon to have somewhere between 8, 10, 12, 13, like appointment type things or, just different things that I might be giving myself to. But I think what you're hearing as a pattern here is all of us is a kind of an early in the week marinating in the text. It's like when we first started Holy Trinity in Costa Mesa, Debbie and our kids were still living in Boise, Idaho, and so I was flying back and forth. So my habit was after church on Sunday when I was in the airport, I would go into I guess I was flying United a lot back then, I'd go into the United room and I would look up the text for the next week and just, as everybody said, just put them in my mind. I don't think I did anything else. I might have printed them out. I think I used to print them off Bible Gateway. I would print out the lectionary text because at this point, I was a brand new Anglican. I was just sort of trying to give myself to the tradition. And so for years, I don't remember exactly how long Beth might, but for years we basically used the lectionary. And so I would print out those texts, so I'm just aware of them. So it's already the next, it's just after church, but I've already got the next Sunday's text in my mind. Monday's my day off, so that's almost always said. So Tuesday's kind of the day to really first dip into it in sort of a thoughtful way, in all the ways that you've heard. I guess for me, I'm kind of an old John Stott, Billy Graham guy, kind of, Between Two Worlds, that famous book of Stott's. Or Graham, I preach with the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other. So that's always been me. As the Jesus movement in which I was steeped was a Bible movement, and so since I'm 19, I was teaching I started teaching the Bible at 19, and so the text of the Bible has always been, it's just intuitive to me. But but then standing between that text and the world, and as Ashley just said, between the text and the actual community that we're with, feels like a really big job for preaching for me, and so that's what I do. Now, with the rhythm of my current life, where I have the church and the diocese and my foundation, the Talis Collective, and writing and speaking and being a professor and all that, I've fallen into a routine. But I'm not so much commending this, because you got to remember, I've been doing this a long time, so I have a deep reservoir of not only talks, but I've just been doing this so long, it's a little easier for me now. But I have to say, I still really enjoy it. So when Friday afternoon comes for me, that's when and I'm old school, I finally get to sit down with my books. Like, books. They're so different than you guys. They're just like, I get out all my commentaries, and if I need them, Bible dictionaries, or encyclopedias or whatever, and now we got all these powerful online tools, or as, Gare said, podcasts or whatever. Now it's Friday afternoon, and I actually have come to love Friday afternoons, because for me, to have the luxury to think deeply about one thing for a sustained period of time is such a luxury in my life that I've actually come, preparing for a sermon almost feels like a luxury to me. Like, really, I get to just sit with my books, and I get to just think about something important. So Friday afternoons, that for me. By Saturday morning, it depends again on my Saturday, but by sometime on Saturday, I'm basically done. But like everybody up here has said, for me, I can't just leave it there. I'm always doing a final, up early on Sunday, doing a final edit, asking the similar questions you've heard here, just like making sure this is really dialed in. And I forget who said it, but like if it doesn't feel fresh to me, I think maybe you said that, Ashley, that's like a big sign to me. If this doesn't feel fresh to me or inspired by the Spirit or something important here, then that would be a big red flag. And I'm always just like making those final checks on a Sunday morning.
Yes, Bishop Todd, I laughed when I heard the question originally about what is the rhythm of your life, because I know rhythm is a hard thing.
I can tell you what the rhythm of this week is. I'll be doing this on the plane tomorrow morning on the way home, and then thank God I don't have anything going on Saturday, and I'll spend most of the day Saturday, because what else was I going to do this week, right? Except for maybe I should have got somebody to preach for me.
Well, that raises a good question, and I think...
Yeah, Beth?
Yeah, Beth, who's out there? It raises a good question, and I think people might be surprised, but how often do you preach at Holy Trinity?
Well, I try not to miss more than one a month, so that would be roughly 40.
Yeah. That's a lot. That's a lot with your travel schedule. Yeah. Great. Well, I have to tell you, I know that there are some people in this very room who are going to be relieved a little bit, I think, and surprised by the fact that you guys are still using commentaries. So I had a comment from someone saying, I'm so under pressure and I'm so tired that I'm reading commentaries. And I said, doesn't everybody? So I'm kind of glad to hear, that relieves me too, that you're still doing that after all this time.
What was the meaning of that comment?
There was a little concern that they should be just doing individual exegesis and coming out with inspiration on their own.
Well, do that early in the week. And then check yourself. Do the Gare, would Gordon Fee, or for me, would Tom Wright would he approve?
Well, and to see commentaries. I mean, if you like your commentaries, I mean, there's lame commentaries, but if you actually like the people you're reading, these are like reading companions.
Right.
I remember it was Daryl Johnson at Regent used to talk about he when he was. His kids were little, and they'd see his stack of books, on a Friday afternoon at home, and he's reading, and they'd say, "What's with all the books?" And he said, "These are my friends, and we're talking about my sermon."
Yeah.
And I love that picture, because these are reading companions, and I love to know that Tom Wright thinks the same way as me on something, especially when I'm being a bit of provocative. It's like, okay, this is good.
Well,
Blame the Bishop of Durham.
I think I maybe hear what's being said, and I'll bet all four of us would agree that it's like a sandwich. There's something that's deeply personal and discerning and communal, but then there is the text, and I would just say you got to do the work on the text, and unless you're just naturally a brilliant exegete on your own, you're probably going to need those reading companions, and then go back again to personal and spiritual. So sort of a sandwich.
Yeah.
Let it start with what the Spirit's saying, do your work, and then fine-tune it again with kind of what's the Spirit saying to our community. That's what I would
How have you guys found over time that it's gotten easier or more challenging? Because when I hear the time that you're spending, I think people might be surprised, given the years of experience, that you're still spending that much time. How has it changed for you over time?
So I can say this in terms of, you do develop a kind of reservoir. You become more comfortable with your own voice. You get to know your church better. I think it's easier for me now, having been preaching consistently here at Trinity for 10 years or so. Easier now than it was. It just comes more naturally. Practice is that's a really important thing. You can even really inspired preachers still need practice, so you just get more comfortable. And the rhythm becomes more natural. I can basically now intuit. Similarly, Gare has a 2,000 word limit, and mine's 14-point font in a Word document, 2.5 pages. And if I exceed that limit, I know I'm going to be exceeding my time. I just know myself well enough to know my notes can't be longer than that. So those things just are more instinctual now. Becoming more familiar with your pastoral instincts, trusting them more, and your textual ones, it just happens with time. So I don't know that there's been, I've watched that time shrink. I just panic less, honestly. I mean, it's terrifying to preach here in those early years. Every time was like, just like going for a firing range, and which is a terrible way to feel, but in some ways that was, how you felt. And now there's the comfortability of standing in a place that I know I'm meant to stand in. And so it comes more easily.
Yeah, I think preaching is a constant experiment for me. And so over time, some experiments work, some don't. And so basically, over time, you've closed the doors of some experiments. It's like, great, I know not to go there again. And so preaching is constantly that. And I'm constantly trying to learn from other preachers. And so now I know, I shouldn't try and do that. I've tried that before, that's going to fail. Yes. So you get into a rhythm more and more about what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And that's the biggest thing. I think constantly stretch yourself, constantly learn from others. And over time, you start to get into a groove about, okay, this is more in line with who I am. This is more in line. When you're your best self in the pulpit, then you will communicate the best. Preaching is truth through personality. So being your best self in who you are. But it takes a while in the pulpit to understand, who is my best self? Am I Tim Keller? Am I John Tyson? Am I Judah Smith? Am I Mark Driscoll? Am I John Stott? And then you realize, I'm none of those guys. I'm Gare. So, but it takes a while to come to that revelation, because actually, I believe you need to first copy these guys in many ways to discover who you are. And so over time, and I've been preaching only 10 years, but I preach a lot. And I think I'm come to the place now, only now after 10 years, where I go, okay, I think I'm not so much of a parrot or a kind of a smorgasbord or a Frankenstein of other preachers. Mm-hmm. I'm a bit more of who I am. And if people come to me, they're starting to hear, oh, that's Gare. That doesn't sound like a bad John Tyson or a bad John Mark Comer or a bad Tim Keller or whoever it is, which I was for many years, or a bad Nicky Gumbel. And if you try that, you are always a bad version of that. So over time, it gets easier because you start to go, I know who I am.
I think part of it is also knowing in the process, for me, I've been going about 18 years, more in the last few years, last 10 years, a lot of preaching now. And I think for me in the process, I've come to the place where I know what needs to happen in my process. Like if I get to Saturday and I haven't literally wept over the text, then I've missed something, right? Because for me, it's got to emerge out of what the Lord is doing on my heart. Not that it's some sort of like doing your dirty laundry and narcissism in preaching, but if it doesn't hit me, how can I expect it to hit anyone else? What really matters about the text? So if I haven't wept over the text at some point, I know that I'm missing something. And so when I get to Friday and that's not there, I'm going, okay, I got to get back into this and spend some more time. So I know in my own process what are the markers along the way that have to happen. And for me as well, a lot of it is learning, your own voice and learning what works for you. I mean, I know how long I can go and hold people's attention. I know how much humor has to get worked in. I mean, I'm so, and it's not like it's a template. I mean, it does move around, although a lot of my preaching does get somewhat template based. I mean, I kind of know early on there's going to be a joke, and I know that basically with every major point I'm trying to make, if you want to get what we call in hockey a one-timer, which is basically where you pass the puck and without even lifting your stick, you just knock it right in, that one-timer, or I guess if you use boxing terminology, that sort of 1-2 punch, or, humor helps you do that because it softens the heart. It humanizes the preacher. It humanizes the moment. And then, the heart is open, and you really have that ability then to say, and do you see what Paul's saying here? Do you see what Jesus is saying? And so working in, knowing where humor has to work in, it is an art. I mean, for me, I think a long time I was really concerned with, it really just had to be kind of in the spirit and not manipulative. And I was so afraid of manipulative. I'm manipulating people with this approach. I finally just said, listen, it's an art. I've got to find a way that my own voice can speak, and I'm not afraid to be saying midweek, man, I got to find some funny stuff in the text, or else this is not going to work. That's not manipulation. That's just knowing your own personality and speaking. And so allowing the sermon crafting moment to be, to be an art. It is an art. It's a craft. It's something that you learn to get better at. And I'm still, somewhat terrified every week thinking, this is the week that everyone's going to realize that I'm a total fraud and I don't know what I'm talking about. There's always that fear of kind of birthing this. But it does get easier. You get to know your own voice, and you learn to trust yourself. I like how Gary says, early on, I still listen to a lot of great preachers, but early on, I just soaked it in. I could not get enough of Keller and Alistair Begg and others. I just had to soak it in because it's only through that kind of repetition and trying stuff out that we find our own voices.
So the only other thing I would say about changing here, as I've already said this week, I think that all ministry is exquisitely local and contextual, and preaching is maybe at the zenith of that. Cultures and contexts change. And so I think that the best communicators have always had empathy for their audience, so they would be governed by the text, but deeply empathetic with their listeners. And we live in a day in which things like authority and truth and the goodness of institutions are not like the church. So increasingly, our audiences are full of people that we can't always assume that they're tracking with our simple assertions. And so I think, along with humor, as it's been said, little statements of empathy, like I realize you might, or you may be thinking, or places where, again, your hearers know that you're with them, that though there is a distance between you, that you're trying to bridge the relational difference, and they feel like that you kind of understand not just what you're trying to say, but you understand them, and that's constantly shifting. I mean, I get what Gary's saying about trying to preach in West LA. I mean, if you're not doing something about every 5 to 7 minutes to get their attention, you're probably not going to have their attention for 25 minutes. So there could be lots of different mechanisms for doing that. But when I hear Gary say that, I just hear somebody who's learned West LA, and it just is what it is. It's not a little town. If you're speaking to, 60 farmers in a little town in Wisconsin, that would evoke, I would hope, a very different sort of preaching. But when you're in West LA doing what Gary's doing, you're just, if you're going to understand your context at all and have any audience empathy, once you have any audience empathy, it will draw out of you something that I think is important and good.
Can I just add something there? I think the hardest thing for me constantly is the easy bit's the exegesis, the easy bit is the text. And I love that, I'm a thinker, so it's easy, right? The hard thing, and it just gets harder and harder, is as you get busier and busier, is to be able to get into the hearts and minds of the people in your congregation and feel where they're at in life, feel their pain, and then bring the text to that pain. And so it's so, in the busyness of preaching, you can just think you've done a great sermon by a great expository but bland sermon. But one person said to me, you have to watch, if you're preaching well, you start to see people lean in. And the text doesn't get them to lean in unless they're a seminary professor. And so what gets them to lean in is when you realize you're speaking about their life. And that, for me, is the hard thing and the Friday thing of, this is all well and good, but what about the guy who is an atheist? What about the guy who is unemployed? What about the guy who's just been rejected 10 times at an actor's audition? How do I speak into their life? And I've got to work really hard at that to make sure the text comes alive in those moments for them. And so humor is more just kind of, let's just make sure that, they need it just to kind of go, oh, this is great, whatever. But that's just the means for me to get in there and bring the text to the personal challenges they're going through. And then they always go, if I've done a bad job, they go, oh, good job. They go, man, that just spoke straight to my life. And it's like, well, it was supposed to. That's what the Bible does.
Well, with that too, I mean, that idea of the New Testament understanding of prophecy, I mean, and again, this is up for great debate, but when you look at the New Testament gift list of prophecy, it's, at least, and I got this from Gordon Fee, who's, super, super charismatic, and would say prophecy in the New Testament is really forthtelling more than foretelling. And there's an argument that a lot of prophecy in the Old Testament is the same way. And so the preacher is the closest to a New Testament prophet that we would see today. And so it's that ability to speak a word with that sense of authority. Like, I believe at the core of my being that this is the word that my congregation is to hear from God. I mean, I could be wrong. I may not be listening. My sin may be in the way. But if I'm faithfully trying to listen, I have to trust that this is a prophetic word for the congregation. So speaking in, and I think that's that, I mean, just to be specific on technique, and we do it in different ways, how we begin our sermons are enormously important. I mean, I think in this culture, maybe 20 seconds to convince our hearers that they want to listen. We just cannot assume, they came to church, therefore they're ready. No, I mean, we all watch that like slow fallback, where they fall asleep, right? You've got 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds to grab attention. And so how we begin our sermons, I think, are important. And I generally, I sometimes start with a story. Sometimes I do a two-part story where I'll start part of the story at the beginning and then do the other half of the story at the end. It kind of is a little like, you got to stick with me because you get the other half of it. But a lot of times I start with a question. I mean, for me, just to be very technical, that's kind of the hermeneutical question is, okay, here's the interpretation of the text. Here's the main points, right? We all learn that in seminary. What's the main point? Or, the main point among the several main points. What's the main one that this text is trying to say? Well, then doing that hermeneutical work to say, okay, who cares? I mean, honestly, in my church, who cares about that main point? And crafting the question is vital. The way and I'll often begin with that question right at the beginning of the sermon. I mean, I was walking through a sermon in Easter series right now of walking through sort of an embodied resurrection future. Started with Revelation 21, second week of Easter. Last week I looked at 1 Corinthians 15. Just, again, this embodied future. What does that mean? And I'm trying to feel like, who cares at one level, right? And so both weeks, the opening question was, or statement in this case, I made a personal statement. I said, I want to learn how to dream again. I want to learn how to dream again, and I want to live into those dreams in a passionate, radical way. That was my opening statement both weeks, and it was just because I could sense that if I started with this idea of hopes and dreams, everybody was there, right? And then that's the hermeneutical connection. Here's why it matters. Here's why it matters to you. And then you can go thoroughly through your interpretation and exegesis and walk through it, but you've got to grab them at the beginning. Why does this even matter?
So, and that's brilliant, Paul. That's brilliant. But how do you guys, you're all four rectors of churches, and I wouldn't say it's an ivory tower, but it can be, right? So how do you get feedback on your sermons, or do you? Aside from the guy that sends you the notes.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, I'm married well. A man who is not afraid to share his opinions when asked, and not otherwise. So that's really helpful because he knows when I may or may not need to hear his feedback, and that if I need it, I will ask for it. So that, and I also have a handful of trusted people that I think I was going to say, I mean, having thick skin in this role is really important. Everybody who steps into any kind of leadership, I think, ought to have that. But if I'm not open to, not just in practice but in spirit, hearing critical feedback from people, then that's going to come across in the way that I preach also. It'll be more defensive. It won't invite feedback. There'll be nothing conversational or even empathetic about the way that I'm preaching. And so I have those people, some of whom are on our leadership team, others who are in our church. And in particular, a couple of those people who do not read theology, would never open a commentary, and don't care largely about the things that I care about, and yet they're there and they're faithful every week. So being able, especially when I'm having a hard time trying to get something out, knowing who those people are that I can go to is huge. Yeah.
We have 2 levels of feedback. Congregational feedback, which is Los Angelinos tell you straight away what they think about your sermon, just in how they react. And I'll get text messages or otherwise, and it's just really obvious. Okay, that was a flop, that was a B-. It's just so obvious. And the congregational feedback then is 2 B-minuses in a row and they don't come back. And so straight away, we're not building the church on the crowd that are church hopping, but if you see a church hopping, you can see them straight away. And they're there for 4 weeks in a row, you go, oh, okay, then this is good preaching. If they're not, then you go, okay, this is not good preaching. So it's really obvious every week. There's a church in our town called Reality LA. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're amazing. And I always joke with the congregation, I'm always 2 bad sermons for everyone going to Reality LA, And then feedback more constructive is we have a team of people who around us who they will say, and I invite them, how can I improve? What can I grow in? And that's a regular internal feedback.
Is that your staff?
Staff.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so do you have an intentional meeting for feedback or an intentional meeting about preaching?
We're about to start because we're about to share more of the sermon load. And so we're about to go to multiple preachers on a Sunday as opposed to just me. And so that means that we've got to be more intentional. I literally downloaded my colleague's sermon about half an hour ago from Sunday night, and I will give feedback on a weekly basis to him. Yeah. And therefore, in order to have the credibility to do that, I'm inviting feedback from him to me. And so we'll do that. Whoever preaches on Sunday will listen to the others and give feedback. Because it's on the same passage, and one person will have created the skeleton, and therefore it's a good opportunity to give feedback.
That's great. How about you, Paul?
So for feedback, I think what Gary's sharing is huge because you get a sense. I mean, I know my context has been 2 years now in Plano. I can just read the room, first of all. I can tell. I mean, I've got certain, benchmarks in the room. And, the people who, normally laugh at a joke and then they're not laughing this week, I'm like, okay, that's not funny. And others who are normally kind of like, there's those people who kind of give you quite a bit back as a preacher, like they're big with their eyebrows and they're nodding and not that you want to watch them because they'll sometimes nod at everything, but some of those benchmarks in the room, I can read intuitively. Okay, they're not tracking with me on this, right? I also have a sense myself intuitively. I just know where my flow of logic is. I know where my heart's at. And I find myself, and I don't know if this is common, I'm sure it is, but I find myself, if I'm at the end of the sermon and I'm kind of racing to add extra kind of things in, I'm like extra caveats that are not in my notes, and I'm like, but, it's kind of like this, but not this, and wow, I'm getting, the lady doth protest too much. It's like I'm starting to, trying to defend my sermon in the moment because I'm feeling it's not tracking. Feedback's huge. I mean, our church is extremely gregarious in their feedback, but are discerning. I mean, there'll be Sundays where literally everybody coming out the door is just saying in a huge way. That just made a huge impact on me. And there's other Sundays where it's like silence. And then like the kind of crazy people come up and love your sermon. And you're like, okay, if only the crazies came up today and none of the other people, that was off, And I will say that guarding the heart with your resiliency, because I'll tell you, I mean, literally in a large church, hundreds of people on a Sunday morning can say that their lives were changed by it. And I get that one email that didn't like my tone or didn't like an illustration, and I brood on that all week long, and I think I'm the biggest failure. And that's 18 years long. I'm still there. Like I have to actively, Foley Beach once said every day he goes home from the office, our archbishop, he said he used to drive by a big like garbage repository thing, and he said as I went by there, I'd stop and I'd literally have this moment like with my hand saying, all right, I'm just putting all the negativity in the trash. Nice. And I have to do that. I will say the last thing though, I do watch my sermons. We film them, and I don't watch them every week, but especially if I think it's off, I will go back on Monday and watch it, and I'll look at it, and I try as much as I can as a critic to say what worked and what didn't, and I'll look and I'll say, why did I say that? That was so stupid. And I think there's part of that ability. If you've got an audio track or video it, I mean, if you can, I mean, it's hard to watch sometimes, but to actually watch it through and say, that was a really bonehead thing to say, and that did not connect, and I don't like my tone. Wow, I'm so serious. Why am I so serious? I think there is something. I mean, have the strength, have the boldness to actually watch yourself and critique yourself if you record them.
All right, one final area, and then we'll open up to the audience. How do you decide? And I'll phrase this generally, and because I know each of your situations different. How do you decide to share the pulpit, and what voices should come from the pulpit? And then how do you coach that?
So up until last week, it was just me as much as possible, because when you're planting a church, the first 150 people will connect with you, and they want to stick because of you, and therefore you need to shape the DNA of the culture, you need to proclaim where you're going, people need to understand your heart. It's a big deal for them to come to a new church, particularly it's small and hokey, and they want to make sure that the shepherd is worth following as he follows Christ. And so I did as much as I could. Secondly, I also believe I hold preaching in high esteem as a gift that is to be trained and honed. And so I came out of a background that anointing and enthusiasm would get in the pulpit, but not necessarily depth and just good teaching. And so we hold it in high esteem. And so we don't let anyone get in there until they can reach that kind of level of maturity in their gift, that their best place now to train is in the pulpit. Their best place beforehand may be in youth group or somewhere else, and we raise them up that way. And then now, we have multiple services and campuses, and so we have to, just so I don't die, have someone else preach one of the campuses. And so that's been really hard, because, we live in a podcast culture where still, even in our tradition, the preaching is of such a high value. And they listen to, the high water level has gone so high with podcasting that people are now used, and they never want to go back again to bad teaching that they used to have before. And so everyone's standard, which I think is great, everyone's standards are super high. And it raises your game to elevate your standard of preaching. And so I value Judah Smith being down the road, because it just means everyone in LA has to get better. And therefore, we've gone and created who in our church can do it. There's 2 people, and so they alternate the other services. But I would make sure I preach 5 out of every 6 in the main services.
I'm learning my culture. 2 years in Plano. I came out of a culture in Ottawa, my last church where I was for 10 years, where it was just the dividing up. 3 priests on staff. So I would preach sort of 2 as rector, and then one of them would preach third, and then I'd preach 2 more. So it was kind of that, 2 out of 3 for me. came to Plano, and the culture is the rector preaches. It's a major piece of what people expect. So in my context, I sort of fought with that for the first while. I did it, but I did it reluctantly. Now I, just recognize that's the call of my role now. It may change down the road. Brian Biba is my kind of backup preacher in the sense, and I don't mean that in a pejorative at all. I mean, he's a good preacher. So when I can't be preaching, 90% of the time, Brian will be in the pulpit, and then we get guests occasionally. But in our culture, people expect the rector, and I struggle with that at times. Is that whole like personality thing? But at present, I mean, my job is less. I think. I mean, in the long run, maybe that's a culture that has to change. But right now, that's not the thing the Lord's putting on my heart to change. I'm like, if that's what I need to do, if that's the call, then I'll be in the pulpit 42 plus times a year. That's just the way it has to be for now. That's I'm not willing to force a culture change and somehow lose the mission right now. Maybe down the road we will, but for now, the rector preaches almost all the time.
Yeah, so we have, over the years, shifted to a more team-driven approach to preaching. I think back when I first started coming to Trinity, Chris was doing 98% of the preaching here. And there were a lot of reasons to make an intentional shift away from that and being more intentional about inviting new voices. I think, as is often the case, you do things by trial and error, and I think we learned quickly we may have shifted too far too fast. And so we, of course, corrected over time to where he and now I, on the other side of town, do the lion's share of the preaching. The majority of it is similar, is assumed that we'll be preaching, and yet the benefit of having a multitude of voices, people in our church getting to hear from different ones of their pastors, people who are leading and pastoring in other respects, has been such a gift, really, to our church, obviously to Chris and I, because it's liberated us to preach most of the time, but not all of the time, and has also been really empowering to other leaders in our church who need to be heard from. They, as leaders here and pastors here, it gives them an opportunity to lead in front of their church. So that being said, however, I agree with you. Not every pastor is a preacher. And that's true. Preaching really is a gift, and it can be really hard, to your question, Kimberly, to know, what can you train and teach and practice and hone, and what is the sort of like raw talent that you're working with, that you kind of know it when you see it and when you hear it. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. There are, because you may be a fantastic pastor, called by God to do exactly what to teach, even, to your point, but preaching is a kind of a set-apart gift, and every church is going to sort of measure that differently. For us here at Trinity, a sort of easy go-to, we're not extemporaneous preachers in the sense that we hop up here with 2 or 3 bullet points and the rest of it's just off the cuff. That's certainly not the case, and yet we are extemporaneous more in our presentation. So we're not preaching from manuscripts, and we're not beholden to notes that way. We try to be a little more free form. And so if that is something that's totally foreign to you or paralyzing to you as a preacher, then this pulpit is probably not going to ever be home for you. That's maybe a really sort of like helpful. There are really excellent manuscript preachers and churches in which that's absolutely not only acceptable but even preferable. And yet that's just not our culture here. And so it's things like that that help sort of like make that distinction. Another really important one I'll just say is like your insight into the text. If Chris and I can sit and say, here's what feels like, if I were going to preach this text, it would probably be this thing that would grab me most immediately, or you definitely have to address this. And if those same instincts aren't there for whoever might come up, if they're majoring on what we would consider to be a really minor point, or that wouldn't land or connect with people, then that's another thing that we look for. Are you able to sort of like read the text and read people? And then you'll have a list depending on where you are that's beyond that. But.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I could listen to you guys all day long, and I appreciate this. I realize that not all of us fit within Scott McKnight's 50-year-old threshold, but that's a lot of wisdom, and thank you for sharing that. Anybody have any questions down here? Yeah.
Hey, y'all. So that's really rich and deep. Can I make you guys get really superficial for a minute and just say, what are some of those like mustard stain technical things that have hurt your ability to communicate something rich and deep? What I mean by mustard stain is if you're in a job interview, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are, how competent you are, how capable you are. If you've got a big glob of mustard on your shirt, no one's listening to you anyway. What are some of the like technical things that have been blind spots, either for you or maybe you've noticed in other pastors, that have nothing to do with their exegesis or their heart for people, and maybe because they've concentrated so hard on that spiritual aspect, they don't realize that their introduction subsumed half their time, or whatever that might be. Are there one or two of those things that you've kind of had to work out in your own practice, or that you commonly see that may be blind spots?
I think for me, it was learning to trust myself. We all have our own history. We all got a personal background. For me, probably my biggest mustard stain was I was a professional stage actor who became a priest, and I was actually at seminary kind of ashamed of my background because it was part of that whole evangelical, no room for creativity, no room for the arts. And so I, for many years, really suppressed it. My preaching was so boring when I came out of seminary. I was a manuscript preacher because Darrell Johnson was a manuscript preacher, and so I was modeling after him. And I was more concerned about being logical and thoughtful. My whole thing was if I can explain Paul's logic, or if I can explain, Jesus' logic in this, that's what really matters. And I think it was still good preaching, but it didn't really get unleashed as much better preaching until I had to deal with my own baggage and say, it's okay to be extemporaneous. It's okay to wander around and have loose notes. I mean, I have notes. I have 2 pages of notes, but I barely look at them. I mean, it's okay to do those things. So I think my biggest thing was actually allowing my own voice and saying, people in the room, I want to be faithful, but I don't need to spend 10 minutes explaining Paul's logic. That's a Bible study. This is a sermon. They're different things.
Yeah, briefly, always know your physical tics. And so I had loads of physical tics to begin with. And when I was trained as a lawyer, they filmed you, and you had to watch yourself out on camera, and ahs, scratch, only look at one half of the room, only look at 3 people. The physical tics, you don't realize they're blind spots until people point them out to you. Talk too fast, talk too slow, too high-pitched all the time so you're exhausting people, or too boring and it's just down here the whole time. Is it an authentic range and tone of voice? Is it yourself? So there's so many physical tics that put people off that you have to watch them and be careful they don't creep in. Particularly when you're listening to a preacher and you think, I want to learn from him, you start to suddenly talk like him. And so just things like that. And then secondly, over content. Too much content just kills the sermon. And so always thinking about just the technical aspects of, man, I would love to talk about that, but I've already got too much, so I need to stop.
Yeah, tempo is a huge thing. I think tone is also a huge thing. If you're talking way too fast, and you're nervous, and so you sound angry or sad. Either way, that's a major put off. I think to a lot of people, long quotes, don't do that. Find a quote and then find the heart of it, and don't read too much is a big one. And people who've ever heard you speak will know exactly what your mustard stain is. You say this thing all the time. You pace back and forth like a cuckoo clock, and it's or you never move. Those kinds of things, and yeah.
So many.
Truly. So I will just say this: if you're too, and this is going to sound hard, but if people are too nervous, if you're too nervous, it's really hard for people to ever hear what you're saying because they want to caretake for you the whole time you're up there, and so it's really hard for them to hear. So whatever you have to do to overcome the stage fright, and for a lot of people, that's like relentless practice, ending up in front of people that you love and trust, and just practicing preaching over and over and over again until you can get up there and breathe and not look like you're going to faint.
I would say probably the number one thing I see is people being too much in their own head. We all talked about our weeks where you have to be in your head. There's an unavoidable cognitive, mental, intellectual aspect of preaching. But once that's done, I think when people can pick up that you're just in your own head, I feel like this is probably the number one thing I see is you're just not then a good communicator. You might be saying true words, But so it's like you have to have your own head without being in your own head. And I feel like that's a trick as you learn to speak.
Oh, go ahead, Gareth.
I would just say, one thing I'm really grateful for when I was learning to preach was not undermining and not belittling just the raw communication gift you have to grow. And so I grew in my communication gift, and I teach my preachers to do so, not even in preaching. I want to see them do other stuff. I want to see them tell a joke. I want to see them do all sorts of stuff. I want them to be, like I give them a scroll of paper, which is like bound with sellotape, so it's really hard to break. And I go, I want you to beat the pulpit until that thing is demolished and emotionally get. So just training the communication gift and then marrying that with the theological side. But I didn't just think we downplay, wow, you got to be a great communicator.
And be able to tell a story and make it interesting and change pitch and tone it. Yeah.
And just to say that, I mean, I love listening to preaching. I've still got lots on my podcast. But now, because of that same issue around communication, my greatest feeding for communication style is watching great film, watching great theater. I get more inspired watching 2 hours of great theater. I walk away as a better communicator because I'm thinking, okay, why did that move me? What happened in that moment where I was just in that moment and could not stop? And why am I still thinking about that? Right? And it's about lyrics, it's about how you write, it's about being concise, all of those kind of things. I think one of the greatest things that any preacher can do, and if I was ever running a seminary for preachers, I'd say you have to go find the local college and take like an introductory class for like acting. Like you have to do that one act. I taught that class in college, like the acting for non-actors. Just get thrown up there, use a script, just be challenged to stand in front of someone, pay attention to your tics and your movements and your vocalization. All of that is vital. And for those folks who are going to be in the room, just statistically, who are rolling their eyes at all of this, saying, this is not what I came out of that tradition, and you don't need any of that, and that's just showmanship. I was with you for a long time, but I got converted away from that. I think communication skill is enormous, and if we're not paying attention to it, we're missing, half of the craft.
Yeah, and if you guys, thank you, Colby, for the question. Colby's also written some great work about reading poetry, reading great literature, and how that affects your sermon preparation and communication skills.
Yeah, I wanted to say earlier that really the best way to learn to write is to read really good writing. And what Gareth said about podcasts and stuff, really the best way to learn to speak is just listen to good speakers. And you do that year after year after year, it just innately gets in you, and you go through a process, as Gareth said, of coming out. You'll feel like a phony for a while, and then you'll come out after some period of time your own person. You will have just sort of taken in all the stuff, and you'll come out the other side. But it's a great way to learn to speak well.
I'll just share my very first mustard stain, okay? This is what it was. And I was preaching, I had no idea until some kind person came up to me and said, you do know you do that a lot when you preach, don't you? I said, what? She said, watch it. So they filmed me the next time. And literally, every 10 seconds, it was this. So, I was horrified. I grabbed my crotch every 10 seconds.
It's that LA hip hop scene.
Like, what?
It's that hip
So
hop
it worked
scene.
for me, so I kept it. So yeah.
Fantastic.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing.
That might be oversharing.
No, but that's just kind of realizing, man, we all start somewhere. Right?
You know we're recording video, right? Anybody else have any questions? Come on up.
First of all, thanks for your wisdom, guys. My question would be, how does a lot of this relate also to the other aspects that ministers perform in the service, like the liturgy? I've heard really good preachers, and then it comes the time for liturgy, and I feel like they have never read before. It just becomes so like you don't actually believe what you're saying right now. You're kind of moving through it. You were so passionate about your own words. It comes to the Eucharist, and it seems like it just falls flat. So how can we relate the two in when we're called upon to actually read or proclaim the liturgy.
That sounds like a Paul Donison.
Is it? I don't know. I think the greatest compliment that I'm given sometimes, I've heard over the years, is people who will say, you know, I believe what you're saying in the liturgy. That's a huge compliment. Okay, good. I'm obviously communicating. I'm reading because yeah, you move from a preaching moment with most of us up here more extemporaneous. You've got your notes, but you're wandering and you're talking freely, and then we move to a very clear script, right, at the Eucharist. And so for me, I find it's just an issue of trying to be authentic. I mean, I don't want to be super simplistic by saying that, but just honestly, authentically speak into the text. Don't try to go drama with it. You know, we're going to do remember those old dramatized versions of the Bible, audio Bibles? And you're like, oh, I just want the normal one. You know, I don't need like the gunfire in the background. You know, like, so don't approach with this really dramatic, I need to be passionate or whatever, but try to be authentic. I mean, you're talking about the death and resurrection of the Son of God. You're talking about sin and grace. And so I think a lot of it is just learning again to speak. And as much as you can, if you can listen to yourself, you'll be horrified. All of us hate the first time we listen to ourselves on audio recording. We hate the way our voices sound. But do it. Listen to yourself and ask, you know, am I authentically, you know, speaking these words? So I find, especially with the Eucharistic prayer, which is the longest piece in the service, I just try to be authentic. I try not to get into a rote. I desperately try not to have a church voice, right? And you know what I mean by church voice. We don't need church voice. Dearly beloved. No, that's, you know, but you know what I mean? Like, we are here to do, like, I can't even do it anymore. I've exercised the church voice. It just has to be real. You have to lead people, but at the same time, because it's formal liturgy, you can't be just flippant about it, right? So again, I just think it's finding that sense of the weight of what you're talking about, but also do it authentically and listen to yourself is a big part of it.
You know, Ashley, I wonder if you would feel this way. Having served at a church plant, I started at a place where I had a very generous rector in Ed McNeil who shared the pulpit regularly, and a loving community who put up with me as I grew. But when I first stepped then into a service where I was running the whole service on my own, it changed my view of my sermon. To look at the collect, to look at what was happening in the liturgy and how the sermon tied with the liturgy, number one, sort of detoxed it for me because I realized Sunday wasn't all about me. And what I was preaching. And then it also added a depth and gave me a way to tie my sermon in to be part of the whole service, not just that one performance.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add to that other than to say that's why timing our sermons has been such a huge part of what we do at Trinity, because otherwise I'm stealing from the table if I've overrun my bounds. And then I'm rushing through the liturgy, and it sounds like I'm rushing through it, like an afterthought. And so I've most definitely had to pay attention to that.
And it means all your message doesn't have to come in the sermon because you know you're going to hit it during the liturgy and that it's going to hang together.
Can I say one thing about the liturgy? I'm, as you know, quite low church, but Michael Green from England taught me how to do it, and he said, just two things, young man. Never add to it. Let the club do the work. Let the liturgy do the work, so don't think you have to add to it. And then say it with worship in your heart. And then you watched him do it. And he's like crying at times while he's reading. And you think it's so authentic, but it's worship. So he's saying it, and people are watching this guy burn on fire for Jesus as he's doing the liturgy. And I realize it's an act of worship, me actually getting into the center of these words and feeling, letting the congregation hear my heart through it.
So it seems like that might be a good way to develop new preachers as well, to be having them lead celebration where they're not having to come up with the words and watch their communication in that. Yeah. There was another question?
No, you hit what I was going to hit.
How are you?
Thank you all so much. One of the things I struggle with is where to keep finding new voices to listen to, so I'm not always reading the same people and hearing the same people. And I'm just curious if there are ways or venues or sources of new voices that you're listening to keep challenging your own thinking.
So here's what I do. I have my stable that I go to, so that would be Alistair Begg, Tim Keller, and then those two, and then I actually listen to Mark Driscoll a lot, and that's in order to try and get some illustrations or things like that. But I will literally go, great, who is worldwide right now drawing big crowds? And I want to know why they're being drawn. And so that's number one. So I'll listen to a lot of Judah Smith right now, and Chad Veach, and I'm not those guys, but I'll listen to them. And then I'll listen to, which is huge for who is speaking to the issues of my generation. And that's wrong, because I'm 45 now. Who's speaking to the issues of the 20s and 30s? And really uncracking the questions that they're cracking open the questions that they're going through. And I want to listen to how they do it. Because I want to listen to how they get a truth and break it open that a millennial or an angry atheist leans in. And those two preachers right now for me are John Mark Comer and John Tyson. So I go, great, they are taking these truths and going, but you're thinking this. And so I listen. So I watch constantly through who's on the conference circuit in America, and I then go, great, I'm going to soak in them for a season to understand why.
Excellent. Yes. Sorry, I'm too chicken to run up and down the stairs.
Thanks to all of you. I have a lament for the early years of my wife having to endure me on Sunday afternoon. And over the years, I've learned how to have a spiritual formation component to what it means to stand in the pulpit. How have you guys lived with that broader impact of the responsibility of preaching and how to do that well, that it doesn't become something strange, it doesn't take over who you are on Sunday afternoon?
Yeah, I think you have to find a way towards some way of appropriately disassociating your personhood from one of your many tasks. But I think Paul already said this, and it's true for me. It doesn't happen so much to me these days with speaking as it does with writing. But I have so many memories of, because normally, when I write, it's either early in the morning or late at night. And I have so many memories of, writing till 10 or 11 at night or something, then taking the dogs out for a walk. And it's like the devil himself would come into my mind. And I can't even use the words that come into my mind in public. But I would just, literally, I'd be walking the dogs and going, what the blank did you just write? That's the blankety blankest bunch of blank I've ever, and literally I would just get assaulted with, nobody's going to want it. What are you doing? Major assault. And this is up to 6 months ago. I don't think in a sense it's ever going to leave us because there's an aspect of spiritual warfare to ministry. So I think learning to sort of distinguish between our own personhood, what is in a sense a holy task, but simply a task, and the voice of the enemy, and learning to, just work that out. And it's way easier said than done. But if you don't work it out, you're not going to likely do this very long or do it very well because it's going to happen.
And part of it too, I think, is there's a maturing that happens, based on the amount of time in the pulpit and the amount of times, you have bad experience in the pulpit, and you preach that lemon, and you're like, man, it's terrible. For me, I've got kind of a ritual on Sundays now where we generally, I'll be sitting there when I know it's not going well, and when you preach 4 times the same sermon, it gets agonizingly worse, and I keep trying to rewrite it in between, but it's like, I can't, this fish is dead. I can't make it alive again. And, You know, I start, actually, if anything, here's a little advice. When I know it's bad, I start cutting. Like, I'm like,
Yeah,
at least
totally.
they will forgive me because it's only,
If you
it's
can't
a
be good,
short.
be
The
short.
worst is to have it bad and to go longer trying to defend yourself. Like, it's just, but I'll get there sometimes at the 11 o'clock service, my last service, and I will literally, when I'm walking away from the pulpit, say, well, thank God that's over. Like, and it's just, and there is a sense of refreshment that just says, okay, that's done, and my family and I are going to probably go out, and, you know, we're in Texas, so we're going to, you know, we're still new to Tex-Mex. We're going to go down to Salsa and, you know, have some food, and I'm going to go home and have a nap or something, and I'll wake up, and guess what? You know, the church hasn't burned down, and my inbox is not full of a bunch of angry letters, sometimes one, but, you know, I think there's a maturity over time that just says it's going to be okay. You know, I think Gareth's point, which is true, and it gets difficult when you, Gareth's point that, you know, you can't be consistently preaching poorly and not have, you know, these new folks stick with you. There is enormous pressure, and there's no way we would not be faithful to you to try and, like, take away that pressure. That pressure's there. Like, you can't preach duds 3 weeks in a row. You'll lose people. But I can preach a dud 1 week, and if anything, what I'll walk away is just simply say, okay, what happened this week? I lost my prep time on Tuesday. I know that's what happened. Like, and I can walk through and sort of analyze it, right? It's kind of like an episode of House, you know? Let's go through and, like, analyze all the problems here. And 90% of the time, 95% of the time, I have done this. I mean, God is gracious, but it's been my lack of preparation. You know, I haven't followed my usual pattern of, no, I didn't weep over the text this week, so I don't care about the text. Should I be surprised they don't care about the text? So just having that ability to say it's going to be okay, but then start Monday again and say, let's go at this fresh.
So I use the post-preaching blues in a number of ways. First of all, I literally do go, wow, is this sifting an idol in my heart? And every preacher preaches for approval in the early days, so yes. Secondly, is this just spiritual warfare, which means just go have a nap and trust in the sovereignty of the Lord. And thirdly, this is every preacher's night. Every preacher, you read the great biographies of preachers, and David Watson went into severe depression. His wife called it the black cloud for a day. And so I realized I don't schedule time with my family much on Sundays. Now, I'm busy because we preach all day, but even then it's like Lizzie and the kids. It's like, no, man, I'm just probably going to snap a bit more. I'm going to be less patient. And I realized someone else said to me, preaching is such an emotionally exhausting experience. Of course you're going to crash afterwards, just naturally. So just don't be around people where you're going to bite their head off. And so Mondays is my day off for that reason. I need to recover. I don't finish preaching until late Sunday night. So Mondays, I allow myself the grace of being grumpy on Mondays. And I embrace it now, but I always have antennae up of, oh no, but is God scratching at an idol of my heart as well as just having a crash?
That's great knowing yourself that way, and I'm sure you've just relieved a lot of people. Well, I know you'll have more questions, and the good news is these guys will be around for lunch, so that'll make for good table conversation. So thank you, everyone, for all of your hard work today and for sharing all your wisdom. Let's pray over lunch.